The Disturbing Case of Junko Furuta. January 1989. A quiet residential neighborhood in Adachi, Tokyo. Police officers stood inside a small, dimly lit house, the air thick with cigarette smoke and something far worse, a smell so heavy it clung to their uniforms. They weren't there for a missing person. They were there because of a separate assault investigation involving teenage boys. But during questioning, one of the suspects began to unravel. His confidence cracked. His voice trembled. Then he said something that made detectives freeze. He told them there was a body. At first, officers thought it was a bluff, a desperate attempt to redirect blame. But the boy insisted. He described a girl. He described Captivity. And then he described where she was hidden. In the backyard. Buried inside a large metal drum, sealed in concrete. Hours later, investigators stood outside in the winter cold as the container was hauled into view. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, unaware they were witnessing the uncovering of one of Japan's most horrifying crimes. The drum was heavy, far too heavy. When forensic teams finally broke through the hardened concrete, a silence fell over the scene, the kind of silence that only comes when reality is worse than imagination. Inside were the remains of a teenage girl. She had been missing for weeks. Her name was Junko Furuta. What investigators would soon learn wasn't just murder. It was prolonged captivity. A crime that stretched on for 44 days. A crime that involved multiple perpetrators. A crime committed not in secrecy, but inside an ordinary home, where people came and went while the unimaginable unfolded behind closed doors. As news spread, Japan was gripped by shock. How could something this horrific happen in a quiet neighborhood? How could so many people know, and no one stop it? Detectives began retracing the timeline. They discovered Junko had vanished in late November 1988 while walking home from her part-time job. At first, it seemed like a typical missing person case. A teenage girl. A nighttime walk. No witnesses willing to speak. But the deeper police dug, the darker the story became. The boys in custody weren't strangers. They were connected through local gangs. And Junko's Captivity hadn't been hidden in some remote warehouse. She had been held in a family home, where parents, siblings, and visitors were present. Some knew. Some suspected. None reported it. As investigators searched the house, they uncovered evidence of prolonged confinement. Signs that Junko had been prevented from leaving. Signs that the crime had escalated over weeks. This wasn't a moment of violence. It was sustained cruelty. And, the more detectives uncovered, the more disturbing the question became. If one suspect had finally confessed, how many others were involved? And how had they kept this secret for 44 days without anyone stopping them? Before her name became tied to one of Japan's darkest crimes, Junko Furuta was known for something much simpler: kindness. She was 17 years old, a senior in high school. Friends described her as responsible, soft-spoken, and hardworking. She balanced school with a part-time job at an electronics store, saving money for her future. Teachers trusted her. Classmates relied on her. She had plans, ordinary teenage dreams. Graduate. Work. Help her family. Nothing about her life suggested danger was waiting. On November 25, 1988, Junko finished her shift and began the familiar walk home. It was a route she had taken many times before. Streetlights lined the roads. Traffic moved normally. There was no sign she was being watched. But she was. For teenage boys had targeted her. Among them was Hiroshi Miyano, a local delinquent with ties to organized crime groups. His reputation alone was enough to intimidate people into silence. The boys followed Junko on bicycles. They approached her under false pretenses, pretending one of them needed help. Then, in a calculated move, Miyano forced her off her bike and abducted her. To prevent her from resisting, they falsely claimed they were connected to the Yakuza, Japan's powerful criminal syndicates, implying that harming them or reporting them would endanger her family. It was psychological control from the very first moment. Junko was taken to a house in Adachi, not an abandoned building, not a hidden bunker. A normal home, owned by the parents of one of the boys. Inside, they told her she would only be held for a short time. If she cooperated, she'd be released. They forced her to call her parents and say she was staying with friends. Her family believed she was safe. Missing person reports were delayed because there was no immediate reason to panic. That phone call bought the perpetrators time. Days passed, then weeks. Junko was never released. Investigators later learned that early on, she had been given chances, brief moments when escape might have been possible. But fear controlled her decisions. The boys constantly reminded her of their gang connections. They threatened her family. They monitored her every move. The house itself became her prison. And the situation inside began to change. What started as captivity escalated into something far more sinister. More people were invited into the house. Friends of the boys. Other delinquents. They were told there was a girl being held upstairs. Some didn't believe it. Until they saw her. Yet no one contacted police. No one intervened. Instead, the circle of knowledge grew wider and more dangerous. By the second week, Junko's captivity was no longer a secret among a few boys. It had become a shared crime. And with every new person who entered that house, the chances of her leaving alive grew smaller. By the third week of Junko Furuta's captivity, the house in Adachi had transformed from a place of illegal confinement into a full-scale crime scene, though no police had yet stepped inside. Junko was held in an upstairs room. Windows were covered. Her movements were controlled. Investigators later determined she was rarely left alone. One of the boys, or someone they trusted, was almost always present, ensuring she couldn't escape or call for help. But the most disturbing development wasn't just the confinement. It was the growing number of people who knew. Teenagers came and went freely from the house. Some were friends. Some were gang associates. Word spread through delinquent circles that a girl was being held there. Visitors were brought upstairs. They saw Junko. They saw her condition deteriorating over time. And yet, no one contacted authorities. Fear played a role. The boys, especially Hiroshi Miyano, used their alleged Yakuza connections as a shield. Witnesses later said they were too afraid to speak out, believing retaliation would follow. Still, detectives would later ask a haunting question. How many chances were there to stop this? Inside the home, Junko endured prolonged abuse and psychological torment. She was deprived of freedom, dignity, and basic care. Days blurred into nights as her captors tightened control. Food was restricted. Sleep was interrupted. Punishments were inflicted for perceived disobedience, even minor acts like attempting to speak out or resist. The longer the captivity lasted, the more normalized the cruelty became among the perpetrators. What began as a crime driven by dominance and thrill-seeking evolved into sustained brutality. Investigators later described it as a collective escalation, where group dynamics fueled increasingly extreme behavior. Meanwhile, Junko's family grew worried. The phone calls she'd been forced to make no longer matched reality. She hadn't returned home. Friends hadn't seen her. Days turned into weeks with no contact. A missing persons report was finally filed. Police began searching. Flyers were distributed. Officers questioned classmates and local teens. But fear sealed mouths shut. Those who knew said nothing. Those who suspected stayed silent. And inside the house, Junko remained hidden, just miles from active search efforts. As December turned into January, the situation reached a breaking point. Tensions inside the group rose. Arguments broke out among the boys. The prolonged captivity was becoming harder to conceal. Junko's physical condition had severely declined. She could no longer be controlled the same way. Then, in early January 1989, a violent confrontation erupted inside the house, triggered by frustration, panic, and the realization that the crime had gone far beyond what any of them had planned. What happened during that confrontation would end Junko's 44-day captivity, but it would also transform the case from abduction into murder. In early January 1989, after 44 days of captivity, the situation inside the Adachi house reached its final, irreversible breaking point. The boys had lost control of the crime they started. What began as an abduction fueled by intimidation and gang bravado had spiraled into prolonged violence they could no longer hide or undo. Junko Furuta's condition had deteriorated severely after weeks of confinement and abuse. She could barely move, barely speak. Panic spread among the perpetrators. The longer she remained alive, the greater the risk of exposure. Arguments erupted over what to do next. Then came the final assault. It was prolonged and violent, an act driven not by a single outburst, but by weeks of escalating cruelty and fear of consequences. By the time it ended, Junko Furuta was dead. She was just 17 years old. But the crime didn't end with her death. Now the boys faced a new problem, a body, evidence, and the certainty that if discovered, they would face severe punishment. Instead of confessing, they attempted to erase the crime. Junko's body was placed inside a large metal drum. The container was filled with wet concrete, sealing her remains inside in an effort to prevent identification and delay decomposition. It was a calculated concealment. The drum was moved and buried in the residential property, hidden in plain sight within the neighborhood where the crimes had occurred. For weeks, the secret held. Junko's family continued searching, unaware she was already gone. Police investigations into her disappearance struggled. With no witnesses speaking and no physical evidence pointing to the house, the case stalled. But the silence wouldn't last. In January 1989, unrelated assaults led police to arrest several teenage boys, including Hiroshi Miyano. During interrogations, detectives noticed inconsistencies in their statements. Under pressure, one suspect broke. He revealed the captivity, the house, the drum. When police recovered Junko's body, the scale of the crime stunned the nation. Media coverage exploded across Japan. Public outrage grew as details emerged, not only about the prolonged captivity, but about how many people had known and stayed silent. The trial that followed deepened that outrage. Despite the severity of the crime, the perpetrators were tried as juveniles. Sentences ranged from several years to around 2 decades, far lighter than many citizens believed justice demanded. Some were later released and reoffended. Junko Furuta's case became a symbol in Japan of systemic failure, of bystander silence, and of the dangers of youth gang culture left unchecked. Her story is remembered not for how she died, but for the questions it left behind. How could so many know and do nothing? How many chances were there to save her? And how did 44 days of suffering unfold inside an ordinary home, without the world noticing until it was far too late?